Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Tamara Rosevan. We're discussing the latest protests in Minsk, Belarus today. We're joined via Skype by Andrei Yeliseyeu. He's a social scientist and investigative journalist currently in Minsk. Welcome to the program, Mr. Yeliseyeu.
Hi.
So for people who haven't seen any of the latest footage coming from Minsk, what can you tell us about the protests and the police crackdown?
In Belarus, it was not just a one-day protest in Minsk, but a series of protests across the country for the last 6 weeks. People came on streets, not only in the capital, but in all regional cities and smaller towns, and thousands of people, most of them, have not taken part in opposition rallies before. So we talk about the protests which came beyond the traditional opposition electorate. And this is a very important phenomenon in present-day Belarus. About up to 1,000 people were detained over the last 6 weeks. Some of them already spent administrative arrests and were released. The courts go on today as well. I speak about the protest in Minsk two days ago. The protests continued even yesterday after the mass arrests on Saturday. So we speak about a series of protests across the country, and we can also see that people coordinate themselves in social networks even without meaningful support of all the opposition structures.
I see. Now, you yourself have been at these protests as well, from what I understand. Now, what can you tell me about the kind of general feeling that you had from people in the crowds, from other protesters?
Well, people are dissatisfied with the poor economic policies in Belarus. This is a third consecutive year of economic decline in the country, and the purchasing ability of population decreased considerably. So all these protests were triggered by the decree on prevention of social parasitism. But in a wider perspective, these protests are against poor economic policies, and many protesters also voice a political agenda, and they want Lukashenko to resign because of his poor economic policies after running the country for more than 2 decades.
Now, Lukashenko has been known to rule Belarus with an ever-tightening iron fist, so to speak. A former George W. Bush's administration official once called him the last dictator in Europe. Now, he's been in power for decades. Is there a general feeling that this is a sign that his power is finally running out?
Well, in case the protests intensify, and in case they are organized, we will see further delegitimization of Lukashenko and removal of his luster of invincibility. His electoral rating now is very low, but we cannot say exactly the number, as the main independent sociological institutes stopped its activities last year because of the pressing of the Belarusian authorities. So we do not know the sociological numbers. No representative national surveys have been taking place in the country in the last month. But we can suspect that the Lukashenko's rating is now lower than 20%, and it continues decreasing.
And would you say that this is the lowest rating he's had in quite some time?
Yes, probably it's the lowest one during his whole period of ruling, or one of the lowest. And as the economic experts say, the purchasing ability will decline further this year and next year probably as well. So the people's discontent will only grow.
And it seems that these protests and the police crackdown will have a massive impact. There's been footage of elderly people being dragged into police vans. There's been footage of women, of seemingly students, of university students being dragged into these police vans. Now, what kind of consequences do you think the police crackdown will have?
Well, of course, some people were intimidated by the Belarusian authorities' response, as not only mass arrests and administrative arrests protesters face, but also there were launched criminal proceedings against dozens of people who are now suspected in organizing mass riots, which is probably a false accusation, as the authorities they represent a legal patriotic camp as a militants camp, allegedly, preparing people for mass riots. We can see that the authorities use false news, fake news, to intimidate people, to discredit the opponents, and to legitimize disproportional measures against protesters.
There's been a lot of links between Euromaidan in Kiev and what happened in Belarus over the weekend, these mass protests, people discontent with the government. Now, we know that in Ukraine, just as you said before, fake news has been used as a tool to misguide people and create kind of panic. Now, do you see a similar scenario unfolding in Minsk?
Well, of course, the number of protesters in Minsk decreased many times because of this campaign of intimidation. Not many people are ready to spend 10 to 15 days in arrest, and probably to lose their jobs or place of education, as in most cases people who spend administrative arrests later fired from their workplaces and so on. But we can see that despite this unprecedented campaign of intimidation, about 4,000 or 5,000 people came on streets in Minsk, and even after the mass arrests on Saturday, hundreds of people came to streets in Minsk and other cities next day. So thousands of people are not into this, are not intimidated by this campaign by authorities, and for many people this not something new, because in the aftermath of each presidential election they use campaign of intimidation and false news about hundreds of militants allegedly coming from Ukraine, for instance, as it was in the aftermath of the last presidential election.
I see. Now, moving on to the protests in Moscow, Russia, as well, over the weekend, where opposition leader Alexei Navalny, he called for an anti-corruption rallies across the country. Hundreds of people have been detained as well. People are discontent with the Russian President Vladimir Putin's government. Now, do you see any links between there, or do you see any similarities between the protests in Moscow as well as other Russian cities and in Minsk?
Yes, I can see the main similarity. That's the main reason of the people's discontent is poor economic policies. Of course, the triggers are different in Belarus or Russia cases, but the main reason is discontent about worsening of economic, social, and economic situation in the countries. And as the economic crisis in Belarus and Russia continues, we will see further protests across the countries.
And just as in Russia, in Moscow, Russia, in Belarus, Minsk, there were a lot of young people that took to the protest. A lot of people in their early 20s, people who perhaps hadn't seen what it was like during the 1990s in Moscow, Russia, when economic times were very, very harsh, as well as in Minsk. Now, do you see that this trend of discontent is mostly within the younger population of Russia, Belarus?
You know, I could see more younger people in the case of Russian protests. In Belarus, the administrative control over students is much stronger. And for instance, in the case of the last Minsk protest, you know, university administrations were, you know, saying to students boldly that if you take place in the protest, then you will be excluded from the universities. So, you know, in Belarus, because of this administrative control, less young people, you know, pupils and students dare to participate in the protests.
Well, we'll keep an eye out on Minsk as well as Moscow, Russia. It's been a very interesting chat, Mr. Yeliseyeu. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
This has been Mr. Yeliseyeu. He is a social scientist as well as an investigative journalist stationed in Minsk, Belarus. You're watching UATV.